Hey folks, and welcome to the channel. My name is Steve, and today we're going to be talking about exposure, or more specifically, we're going to be talking about aperture. Now, it doesn't matter if you're just trying to capture a quick snap for Instagram, or you're working on the next greatest indie hit. Getting your exposure correct is absolutely vital. You will find that over time, you realize that pictures just aren't as appealing if they're underexposed or if they're all overexposed and crunched at the top. You'll find that you can't do proper color grading. The image starts to fall apart anytime you try to play with it or address it. You'll find that overall, an image is a lot easier to work with and has a lot more legs in terms of how much you can play with it if it's properly exposed. Now, the thing is, newer people come into the creative world, whether it's photography or filmmaking, and they often get very, very confused by all the different elements that we use to create a proper exposure. It's really not that hard. There are three fundamental tools built into the camera, and then there's a couple of add-ons that we use to modify things after the fact. Once you've got your head around it, stumbling on words there, once you've got your head around it and you understand what you're doing, it's really not that hard. So I'm going to break things down into three separate little videos. This one's going to be aperture. The next one is going to be shutter speed, followed by ISO, and then I'll quickly recap some of the other stuff that we need to know about at the end. This is really basic stuff. This is entry-level, beginner 101 exposure. Now, aperture. The easiest way to get your head around aperture and what it quite literally is a giant hole in the middle of your lens. If you imagine the barrel of your lens and you've got glass on one end and glass on the other, right in the center there, there's a hole, and it can close down and it can open up and it allows the light through. It is perhaps one of the oldest tools that we have when it comes to photography and filmmaking. The oldest cameras in history didn't have anything else. You literally took the cap off and it just let the light shine through the aperture. Now, it does have, like most things in this realm, there is a primary and there is a secondary effect. The primary effect is the one that we're going to be talking about the most today. That's the one that affects exposure. The secondary effect is the one that we use for creative purposes. So I'll get to that one in a second, but keep in mind that everything that I'm talking about has those two different angles, and you will be working with them to create your final image. Getting back to aperture, like I said, a big hole down the center of your lens. That's quite literally all it is. And when you close it down, it lets in less light. Therefore, your image gets a little bit darker. And when you open it up, you're letting in more light. That allows your image to be brighter. Straightforward so far, right? If you are taking a picture of a scene and it comes across as a little too dark, you're going to open up that aperture, let more light in, and it's going to be a better image. And if you just stick with that and nothing else, all other things being the same, that's a pretty basic and pretty straightforward way of controlling the exposure of your image. As I said earlier, it's not the only thing we have, and there are three other things that all have to play into effect there. It creates what we call the exposure triangle, and aperture is right at the top. It's the first one you're going to encounter. It's the most basic one there is, and it is vital to understand it. A couple of the things that you need to know in terms of the secondary effects of aperture is that it has an effect on your focus. And what I mean by that is there's something called the focal plane, or more commonly known depth of field. And what that means is how much of your image is going to be in focus and how much is going to fall off into blur. So if you have a very, very shallow depth of field, most of the distance and some of the stuff that's really, really close is going to be all blurry. Just a little bit's going to be really, really sharp. If you have a really, really shallow depth of field, you might take a picture of someone's eyes perfectly in focus, but the tip of the nose or their ears starting to fall out of focus. And sometimes that's an effect that you want, but usually in portraiture, that's a bad thing. You want the face to actually mostly be in focus. Thing about this is that it's a highly subjective thing. It depends on what you're doing. It depends on what you're creating. If you are, say you're making a movie and you want to film someone talking, and you want them to feel isolated and alone. Their scene is separate from the rest of the world. You may want to throw all of that background out of focus to really bring the attention to them. However, if you're making a film and you wanted to have, say, the environment be overwhelming to them, say they're in a train station and there's people running around and bells are ringing and they're just getting overwhelmed, you would probably want to have a very, very large depth of field because you'd want to show everything that is impinging on them. There's a lot of creative effects that you would use depth of field for. So it's got that secondary purpose, and that secondary purpose is primarily used in a creative manner, but it will affect your exposure. This is why that triangle is important and why it's vital that we understand how these three things play a part. As I said earlier, very, very simply, if you close down that aperture, you are letting in less light. But at that point, you're having a wider depth of field. If you open it up really, really wide, you're letting in a lot more light, but you're getting a shallow depth of field. So what happens when you want that shallow depth of field? You've got your setup, everything is perfect, and you want that shallow depth of field, but when you open up your aperture, now your image is overexposed. Things are just clipping. Clipping, by the way, if you're newer to this, clipping is basically when there's so much light that the sensor, the camera can't process it properly, and it just loses all the information. That's the simplest way to put it. And you can't bring clipping back. Once it's clipped, it's gone. There's no repairing it after the fact. So what happens in that situation? I want a shallow depth of field, but I've got my aperture wide open to do that, and that's letting in too much light. There are things we can do to avoid that, and that's where the other two parts come in. And those are things I'm going to get into in the next video. I hope this was helpful. I hope this explained things in a clear and concise manner. I know I'm not always the most concise. And yeah, I will get to the next video as soon as possible. See you then.